Hello and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larsson.
Tom, thanks very much for joining me today on the Grow Places podcast, having us over at your amazing office on a sunny day, surrounded by all of your various projects on the wall. It would be great to introduce yourself, and then maybe if you could sort of summarise, what do you think connects all these projects together?
Sure. So I'm Tom Holbrook. I'm director of Fifth Studio. I guess we're sort of, our portfolio spans from leafy Oxford, Cambridge colleges through to heavy industry, railways, kind of infrastructure. It's quite a confusing spectrum of stuff. The thing that sort of tends to unite those bits of thinking are really interest in complexity, a kind of interest in creating narratives about how things at different scales interrelate. I guess an interest in synthetic thinking, so gluing stuff together, thinking beyond silos, drawing together different sorts of knowledge, and thinking about things that maybe would be in quite separate little boxes. We got really interested when we set up in the stuff that architecture at that moment, I guess in the 90s, had forgotten that it was interested in. So those kind of territories that were once quite kind of central to the discipline, if you like town planning, the idea about new towns and cities, planning generally, landscape, strategy, logistics, industry, industrial design, that kind of spectrum of stuff, together with traditional architecture and conservation. I guess we very much started in Cambridge originally with that idea of working with what exists. So what's now referred to as retrofit or creative reuse, I guess, is sort of very much in our DNA as a practice.
Yeah, no, amazing, and it's all the stuff that we find quite interesting as well, because cities, places, towns, they aren't one-dimensional, are they? By their very nature, they are the intersection of different physical things, but also obviously people and transport, and that's what makes them what they are. And it's refreshing almost that kind of like general practitioner idea of what you're saying around urban design and planning and development. But I can imagine developing a business. That's people like to put square pegs in square holes, and etc. So how have you found that over the years? I imagine intellectually it's very enriching, and for the people working here, but actually trying to navigate through how you tell that story about yourselves to clients, etc. Yeah,
it's very tough and very much at the forefront of our minds at the moment, because we're just we're constantly trying to explain that story. We originally would describe ourselves as generalists, but nobody wants a generalist, right? I mean, it's just who it feels very weak. And we're probably, the sort of knowledge that we bring to stuff isn't general. It's kind of, it is about, we have a very senior team, very experienced team, and they bring real expertise. So in a way, that sort of, to describe that as generalism, although it has a kind of wide spectrum, but it is, there are particular sort of things that you get really good at doing. But yeah, it's super tough. And I guess we've just, it's best described through saying, well, look, we've spent 20 years in this place doing very different roles over time, but collectively kind of contributing to shaping change and developing that kind of narrative about change and regeneration.
And if you go back over that sort of 30-year or so period and thinking about these sort of fringe is the right term, but fringe aspects of the profession and fringe maybe locations, has there been much change over that period in how you operate within the system in terms of who you work for, the types of briefs, the types of locations?
Yeah, no, there really has. I mean, I suppose one thing that we're all experiencing is a resurgence of planning and creative planning. I think everyone's woken up to the fact that we need to get much better at it. It needs to be a tool for shaping change and for driving change. Now new towns are back on the agenda again. That legislation has always been on the books, but suddenly it's like much more available to start thinking about using. And in a number of areas, like I said, about retrofit and creative reuse, working with existing buildings, that's certainly come up the agenda. So I think that kind of understanding about why you need a strategy and the relationship between detailed projects and strategy, but those have all come to the fore, and people, I think there's a political resonance. Politicians have realised that that's powerful. So that's definitely a shift. But you're right in the fringe observation, I think, because so much of our work is literally on the fringes, and it's whether that's the edges of a city or a typical fifth studio situation is border country. It's on the edge of 2 or 3 different planning authorities, or like the Olympic project, I guess, the Lee Valley's been a boundary condition for millennia. So we find ourselves, we're always cropping up in what have now become quite familiar situations of like, okay, so there's a political boundary, but there's also like loads of infrastructure, and there's a really difficult rail line and lots of severances and a river and etc. And those are the places where it just needs a lot of intervention to make something happen. And similarly with conservation, it's quite a lot of our work with Oxbridge colleges are with a building that they did in the 70s and a 17th century Grade 1 listed building, and then a lot of land that's could be brought into more productive uses, and a desire for something new. And it's sort of like that mix is a really sort of heady one, trying to get your head around that and what's the right thing to do and the right order to do things in.
Yeah, interesting. And like as you say, everything you're talking about is, well, for me particularly, is very intellectually rich and stimulating and challenging and a draw in those senses. But development is hard enough at the best of times, isn't it? On a flat piece of land with one owner and an entity. So maybe you probably have quite a unique perspective over that period about how actually these fringe, these mixed, these border locations, how have you seen those actually translate into projects, into delivery? Is there a trick to that? Is there anything you've learned or insights from that?
The Olympic Park is probably the best example of something going really well. There's lots of things in the UK that we could do better, but I think the Olympic project is an extraordinary thing, and generally speaking, it's been well done and it's pretty rapid. So when we got involved in 2006 originally, it was really early days. Ken Livingstone was the Mayor of London, really saw the opportunity to use the Olympic project as a kind of tool to address very stubborn levels of poverty in that area. And I guess, the legacy as it was framed, the sort of upshot of that is still playing out, and it's certainly where London is changing most rapidly. And we're still involved. 20 years on, we're still involved in that project, trying to, with as the fortunes go up and down. We were, our client, the London Thames Gateway Development Corporation, was in the same sort of area as Lehman Brothers. So I remember going to a project meeting pretty early on in that project, and these people coming out with boxes of their, family pictures and keyboards and stuff, and that was kind of the end of a certain moment in that. So we've seen some incredible economic cycles, ups and downs, different client organisations, different sorts of work, from master planning to delivery through to sort of bits of infrastructure, very long-term plans, and then projects like Blocks a bit further up the Lee that sort of open access factory that was delivered kind of as part of that thinking. So an extraordinary. So to answer your question about how does it work, I suppose it's just you need some pretty stubborn people to stay in there to ride those waves of ups and downs, and in that case a very effective development corporation that owned land, that could assemble land, that could draw on finance, could do stuff sort of proactively in order to shape and create a market that others could then sort of participate with. So I think that's been an extraordinary experience. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. And as you were talking there, I was thinking about the notion of viability in this. And I don't just mean financial. Obviously, financial is part of it, but technical viability, political viability. When you're in all of these boundaries, and as you say, it does often take that determination and some key figures within that. And when we talk about new town agendas or using railway land or other things, which I know you're involved with. Do you think that the formation of something like a Platform 4 or the bodies like Homes England, these kind of, or the New Towns Commission, these things are the sort of the tip of the arrow, so to speak? They kind of need to be there to push through, because public-private development partnerships, etc., are good and helpful, and obviously private developers can bring investment as well. But the sorts of locations that we're talking about here, particularly at this time, there is not really going to be that sort of that delivery unless some of these mechanisms are in place. So, how's your experience working in those environments, and what's your sort of thoughts on where we can go, really?
Yeah, I think Platform 4. That's a really exciting development around railway land, and so often a railway, brings these incredible system benefits about connecting places up, and quite rightly the MPPF has started to frame around much higher expectations about what happens around stations and so on. And I think an organisation that can use railway land and be, address some of the massive risks that there are around working with them, that's really necessary to, to come forward. And there are very few organisations that can do that. However, I think there is I think there's a need to open up the process a bit more. There's a lot of reliance on big house builders. We've lost that kind of medium grain of development professionals, of developers and contractors. And I think that's really problematic because you need that sort of agility. You need, I think, both interventionist public sector that's ready to take on risk and can set stuff up, can take on these big plots as a master developer. But you need the follow-on, and at the moment I think the follow-on is really not there. That's, from our point of view, a big concern. And I do think we need to get better at the relationship between strategy, between infrastructure, which is too often siloed within transport professionals. We don't look enough at what the transport is doing, what kind of place does that create? Because the railway, although it connects stuff up, creates severance and creates a kind of scar tissue, if you like. So many of our projects are dealing with the consequence of that, whether that's Stratford station or whether it's a new line somewhere. It's very hard to cross the railway line. It's hard to work next to it. So I think we need to evolve some thinking around how we do that better, how we use land better, more productively, bring uses right to the station area, and get the most out of that kind of public investment in infrastructure to make great places that connect well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so would you see that kind of like that orchestration role then as something which, obviously you're a part of that process, but how does that work at its best? Is like, if you were to go back and like pick an example maybe over that period of 30 years where you were like, God, we were really motoring here. This was really like stakeholders were aligned. There was real momentum. It feels like, frankly, in the UK, obviously there's a lot going on globally at the moment, but momentum and dynamism are not really words I would associate with the UK at the moment, particularly in terms of what we do. And as I say, there's various reasons for that. But is there anything you can go, God, we were really rolling then? You've mentioned the Olympics, which maybe is a good example of that, but that was a unique project, and I think it's been an incredible global exemplar of how to do the Olympics in a way that's not just about the Olympics, in a really sustainable way. But it does show, doesn't it? Like, obviously, if every fringe project or every infrastructure project had the dynamism that the Olympics had, where we could be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's that. I mean, I get really excited by stuff linking up and joining together, and that includes politics, economics, the kind of the art of the possible, I think. And we, I suppose my earliest example of that really coming together was Richard Rogers and Ken Livingstone and a whole bunch of people like Mark Brearley around the architecture and urbanism unit. And that was really, the new mayor of London, a newly established post, fairly unfettered by, sort of backstory, a history, and kind of not having the skills that it needed. And you had that a conversation I know recently with Pooja Public Practice, but I think that kind of figuring out that to do this, I'm now in control of a city. What do I need to do in order to make policy, which is something relatively abstract? How do I make that flesh? How do I make that really happen? And the architecture and urbanism unit was really that one of those moments where, okay, so London's going to need some big thinking about, I don't know, the estuary or the area around the Lee Valley, or stuff that had been neglected. And I used to live in London sort of in that period, and it was a great place to be, but it wasn't particularly functional. Cycling infrastructure, how we move around, how the transport system serves the city. And I think what was really interesting about that was that the profession had lost those skills at that moment, and there were lots of trips abroad to the Netherlands to people like Maxim and West 8 and others who had retained that kind of ability to think strategically, to make a plan, to articulate policy spatially. And gradually the Architecture and Urbanism unit pieced those skills back together in London with London practices, and we benefited from that, as did many of our peers. It's just, okay, we've now found a client for stuff we've all, I had been teaching that stuff at Cambridge when we set up the practice, but to have a client for that was really exciting. And I can see that happening now with, the emerging sort of regional mayors, the ability to fuse together in a place that you know well, a very specific place, political clout, kind of popular policies, transformational policies, local economics, kind of macroeconomics, and the resources to do stuff or to lead on stuff around a kind of mission, if you like. This very helpful phrase that Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, came up with. Sort of her example is the Apollo program, but kind of articulating this is where we want to get to, and these are the tools we need, including design, architecture, better public realm, transport, these kind of physical things that I think we tend to neglect in this country.
No, thank you for that. That's a really, really, really like deep and insightful sort of perspective, I think, on exactly where there is this opportunity, if you look at it in a positive sense, like where we could, whether through, as you mentioned, partly through this kind of maybe some devolution or some control given back to places more locally, but in essence it doesn't matter if it's a local or if it's a national. It takes that kind of leadership, doesn't it, and that kind of that strength of will to kind of see some of these things through that aren't easy. And maybe just on that then, like for you personally, why? Because as we've touched on, this working in architecture, urban design at the best of times isn't easy. Doing it in these kind of sort of slightly off generalist ways, maybe we'll call it that, but generalist ways, fringe locations, everything you've just described better than I just did there. Like, do you have a sense personally why you do that kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've thought about a bit. I mean, I grew up in fairly remote places. My dad was a writer, so we tended to go to, he just wanted quiet, so he could get on with his writing. And so as a kid, I ended up with him in his study. I'd be left to my own devices. So I spent a lot of time hanging out in the woods, building kind of worlds, I suppose. And that very much kicked it off. And then by the time I left school, my first job was in the theatre, so I was then apprenticed as a stage carpenter. Spent the first few years of my working life as, backstage in this kind of location, which is very much to do with putting stuff on, making, using relatively small budgets to make big impressions. And I guess that was just a really interesting, and that progressed into film, where it's sort of just similar kind of thing with a slightly more money. And I think that kind of that idea of being an impresario, or kind of pulling stuff together, or putting something on, bringing stuff from different threads into a situation that is engaging. It's always been really motivating for me. And I guess that was my path to architecture, because people said, well, if you want to come off the tools and be part of the art department, it's a very class-driven industry in film, so you need a degree and you need to go to Kingston, and it was really at Kingston that I made that shift from, with some incredible tutors, from film design and TV through to, you could actually do this stuff as a permanent situation and spend like 20 years thinking about something rather than a week thinking about the next game show setting or whatever it was that seemed very, very impermanent to me by then. Yeah, so I guess that's what's that's been the thread. I didn't ever mean to be an architect. It was just the closest approximation to the sorts of things I was interested in.
Yeah, really interesting. And we've talked a lot about the big picture, urban design, strategy side. But what you've just touched on there is the making side, isn't it, of this, and making buildings, true. And that sort of change of scales. Do you enjoy that change of scales within what you do?
Very much so, and I think that's quite unusual. That so we work a lot with, the big multidisciplinaries. Increasingly, as we move into sort of heavy infrastructure, we're working quite often with the big engineers, and I guess they bring lots of different skills and cover that spectrum of disciplinary knowledge. But we do that in a very different way, in a very within a small team. That knowledge is kind of much more mixed up, and there's something it's sort of transdisciplinary rather than multidisciplinary. I think that's an interesting shift, and through that, I guess we're finding threads between different demands, and we're also zooming in and out from the big picture through to how would we deliver that as a sort of piece of concrete you can rest on in this location. So I think that kind of interest in making and an interest in strategy within the same team, and often within an hour, on a project, it is pretty unique, and I think it's really informed the work we do and the way we approach things like a new railway line. Different sorts of knowledge at very similar moments brought together. There was a great, actually, that with current world affairs and stuff, the war with Iran. There's a number of people that come on the radio, kind of warologists, that talk about these issues. And there was a great quote. I mean, mostly it's nonsense, but I think sort of former head of the army or something came out with this. I'll read it to you because I thought it was really good. This is by Sun Tzu, a Chinese kind of military tactician, and he apparently said, "Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat." And that describes so many projects that we've kind of, you have to have those two components of it. Why are you doing something and how are you doing it? The sort of operations, the tactical knowledge is, and I think having that at the same time within a small team is a very sort of fruitful way to approach the wicked problems, kind of really intractable, complex issues.
No, amazing. And maybe we should send that to the White House.
Well, exactly right. Note. That's right. All the gear and no idea.
Exactly. And so with this sort of thinking and this perspective in mind, then, like if you sort of project forward over, hopefully, you mentioned earlier, whether it's Lehman's or other things, things that go in cycles, and maybe in downturns there's an opportunity, although it's painful at the time, to maybe think a bit more long term, strategize, and so let's think optimistically that we sort of spring out of the gates from this latest kind of downturn, which I'm not sure we will, but it might be a bit slower than that. But what does the next sort of period, 5-10 years or so, look like in terms of what you're hopeful we can achieve collectively, but also for you as a business?
Yeah, I think that's a $1 million question, isn't it?
That's what people come to the podcast for.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've been sort of bumping along the bottom for quite a long time, and it does feel like surely we must be on the upswing now. You know, maybe this will work, maybe that will work, and there've been such a series of shocks, I guess, to the economy that have just sort of strangled things a bit and made it difficult to get going. But it does feel there are some problems that won't wait for us to kind of get going. You know, most obvious of which is climate collapse and biodiversity issues in the environment. But there's a whole host of them, including affordable housing and how we address carbon, I think. So somehow we've got to find a mechanism to get on with that. And at the moment, it's clear that, you know, not very much is viable in traditional ways of approaching things. And if you look at, you know, traditional appraisals and so on. But I think we're getting close to the point where actually that's not going to wash anymore. So somehow that kind of traditional economic model has to shift in order for some stimulation to the economy to work. And whether that's a kind of war footing, you know, we've seen actually that in military situations. I mean, the London Plan came out of 1944, the ruins of the Second World War. Patrick Abercrombie had the first inklings of how London could respond to growth, probably at a point where the country had never been poorer. And we know that was a very fecund moment for new ideas, right? The NHS, kind of social safety net, kind of new ideas about education and access and ways that, you know, social relationships and all sorts of stuff. So an idea of really fresh thinking, and maybe, you know, rather than sort of stodging on with, well, we can't afford anything and nothing's viable and we can't invest, we need to get to that kind of moment. I hope so, because I think otherwise it's, I think the austerity mindset has been really, really damaging to the environment particularly. Even that's at a level of detail, you know, tripping over a pothole on the way home, or stuff not working, and towns and cities being really hollowed out on their high streets, and sort of lack of general investment and care in stuff. I think that comes with all kinds of economic and political ills. So at some point we're going to have to say, well, hang on a minute, let's just sort of rethink it a bit, sidestep the problem, and find different ways to get going.
Tom, thank you very much for your time today on the Grow Places podcast. It's been fascinating talking to you, learning more about that wide range of experience and skill set, and something which I think is really unique and really needed in terms of everything we've talked about today. So thank you for that.
Great. Thanks for asking me along.
No problem.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.